Welcome to Alamein to Zem Zem, Keith Douglas's powerful account of his experiences in World War II. This book isn't just about battles, it's a deeply personal story of what it's like to live and fight in a world torn apart by war. With vivid descriptions and honest reflections, Douglas takes us from the Battle of Alamein across North Africa, sharing moments of chaos, courage, and humanity. This is more than a war memoir, it's a journey into the heart of what it means to be a soldier. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing. These are his words. Let's begin. I am not writing about these battles as a soldier, nor trying to discuss them as military operations. I am thinking of them, selfishly, but as I always shall think of them, as my first experience of fighting. That is how I shall write of them. To say I thought of the Battle of Alamein as an ordeal sounds pompous, but I did think of it as an important test, which I was interested in passing. I observed these battles partly as an exhibition, that is to say, I went through them a little like a visitor from the country going to a great show, or like a child in a factory. A child sees the brightness and efficiency of steel machines and endless belts slapping round and round, without caring or knowing what it is all there for. When I could order my thoughts, I looked for more significant things than appearances. I still looked, I cannot avoid it, for something decorative, poetic, or dramatic. The geography of the country in which I spent those few months is already as vague to me as if I had learned it from an atlas much longer ago. The dates have slipped away, the tactical lessons have been learned by someone else. But what remains in my mind, a flurry of violent impressions, is vivid enough. Against a backcloth of indeterminate landscapes, of moods and smells, dance the black and bright incidents. I had to wait until 1942 to go into action. I enlisted in September 1939. And during 2 years or so of hanging about, I never lost the certainty that the experience of battle was something I must have. Whatever changes in the nature of warfare, the battlefield is the simple, central stage of the war. It is there that the interesting things happen. We talk in the evening, after fighting, about the great and rich men who cause and conduct wars. They have so many reasons of their own that they can afford to lend us some of them. There is nothing odd about their attitude. They are out for something they want, or their governments want, and they are using us to get it for them. Anyone can understand that. There is nothing unusual, or humanly exciting, at that end of the war. I mean, there may be things to excite financiers and parliamentarians, but not to excite a poet, or a painter, or a doctor. But it is exciting and amazing to see thousands of men, very few of whom have much idea why they are fighting, all enduring hardships, living in an unnatural, dangerous, but not wholly terrible world, having to kill and to be killed, and yet, at intervals, moved by a feeling of comradeship with the men who kill them and whom they kill, because they are enduring and experiencing the same things. It is tremendously illogical. To read about it cannot convey the impression of having walked through the looking glass, which touches a man entering a battle. I had arrived in the Middle East in August 1941. As a result of passing a course on which I was sent by accident, I found myself posted away from my regiment to a divisional staff. I still wanted to get into action, and probably looked impatiently at my colleagues and superiors on this staff. For 8 months, I honestly tried hard to make sense of the job I was given, in other words, to persuade the staff colonel and major, to whose department I was attached, to give me some work to do. The situation emerged clearly and simply as the months passed. My job was to give camouflage training. The staff officers of General Staff, under the General, arranged training programs. They invariably forgot to include camouflage. At first, they airily agreed to my humble reminders with a wealth of condescending language. The General alone refrained from calling me old boy, although he said, good morning, as civilly as Siegfried Sassoon's general. After 8 months of relative inaction, not being at any time a patient person, and having a hatred for wasted time, I tried to get back to my regiment. I could not be released. With the charm and politeness with which everyone on a staff always speaks to everyone else, I was told I was indispensable. Any disclaimer of this, any statement that I was doing nothing but waste government petrol and money, appeared to strike them as a conventionally modest reply, equivalent to saying, I'm only doing my job, old boy. The offensive loomed very large in rumor, among so many officers living more or less inside the horse's mouth. I decided, if there were no other means of going into action with my regiment, to run away from divisional headquarters in my truck and report to my colonel. I thought vaguely that this might be straightened out later. To plan this was the natural result of having the sort of little boy mentality I still have. A little earlier, I might have wanted to run away and be a pirate. But it was surprising how easily the plan was realized and justified. For 8 months I had done no mechanized training. My regiment was equipped with tanks, guns, and wireless sets, which I had never handled, scarcely seen, in my life, and it seemed possible, and even likely, that my colonel, who had applied for me before the battle, would not want an untrained officer to join him during action and endanger everyone's life while learning his job. If he refused me, I was determined not to come back to division, but to drive away down the coast road to Alexandria, and from there through Cairo and Ismailia, and across the Sinai Desert to Palestine, to amuse myself until I was caught and court-martialed. The Battle of Alamein began on the 23rd of October, 1942. 6 days afterwards, I set out in direct disobedience of orders to rejoin my regiment. My Batman was delighted with this maneuver. "I like you, sir," he said. "You're shit or bust, you are." This praise gratified me a lot. 6 days after I had heard rumbling on the western skyline, that famous barrage that began it, I moved up from the rear to the front of the British attack. Through areas as full of organization as a city of ants, it happened that 2 days before, I had been reading Maeterlinck's descriptions of ant communities. I drove up the signposted tracks until, when I reached my own place in all this activity, I had seen the whole arrangement of the army, almost too large to appreciate, as a body would look to a germ riding in its bloodstream. First, the various headquarters of the higher formations, huge conglomerations of large and small vehicles facing in all directions, flags, signposts, and numbers standing among their dust. On the main tracks, marked with crude replicas of a hat, a bottle, and a boat, cut out of petrol tins, trucks appeared like ships, plunging their bows into drifts of dust and rearing up suddenly over crests like waves. Their wheels were continually hidden in dust clouds. The ordinary sand was being pulverized by so much traffic into a substance almost liquid, sticky to the touch, into which the feet of men walking sank to the knee. Every man had a white mask of dust in which, if he wore no goggles, his eyes showed like a clown's eyes. Some did wear goggles, many more the celluloid eye shields from their anti-gas equipment. Trucks and their loads became a uniform dust color before they had traveled 20 yards, even with a handkerchief tied like a cowboy's over nose and mouth. It was difficult to breathe. The truck I drove was a Ford 2-ton vehicle, a commercial truck designed for roadwork, with an accelerator and springs far too sensitive for tracks like these. I was thrown, with my 2 passengers, helplessly against the sides and roof of the cab. The same was happening to our clothes and possessions in the back. The sun was climbing behind us. As far as we could see across the dunes, to right and left, stretched formations of vehicles and weapons of all kinds, 3-ton and heavier supply trucks of the Royal Army Service Corps, field workshops with huge recovery vehicles and winches, 25-pounders and quads, Bofors guns in pits with their crews lying beside them, petrol fires everywhere, on which the crews of all were brewing up tea and tinned meat in petrol tins. We looked very carefully at all these, not having any clear idea where we should find the regiment. We did not yet know whether they were resting or actually in action. I realized that, in spite of having been in the Royal Armoured Corps for 2 years, I had very little idea what to expect. I like to picture coming events to myself, perhaps through having been much alone, and to rehearse them mentally. I could not remember any picture or account which gave me a clear idea of tanks in action. In training, we had been employed in executing drill movements in obedience to flag signals from troop leaders. We had been trained to fire guns on the move and to adopt a vastly extended and exactly circular formation at night. But most of my training had been by lectures without illustrations. What few words of reminiscence I had heard from those who returned from actions in France and the desert suggested that no notice of the maneuvers we had been taught was ever taken in the field, which left me none the wiser. None of us had ever thought much of the drill movements and flag signals. News films, just as later on that mediocre film Desert Victory, gave no idea where most of their action pictures were taken. Even my own regiment had been known to put their tanks through various evolutions for cameramen. So, feeling a little like the simple soul issuing from the hand of God, animula blandula vagula, I gazed on all the wonders of this landscape, looking among all the signs for the stenciled animal and number denoting my own regiment. I was not sure yet whether this was an abortive expedition. Tomorrow might find me, with a movement order forged on my own typewriter, scorching down the road to Palestine. All my arrangements had been made to suit the 2 contingencies. I had dressed in a clean khaki shirt and shorts, pressed and starched a week or 2 before in an Alexandria laundry. My Batman, Lockett, an ex-hunt servant with a horseman's interest in turnout and good leather, had polished the chinstrap and the brasses of my cap and belt till the brasses shone like suns and the chinstrap like a piece of glass laid on velvet. In the truck, besides Lockett, rode a fitter from divisional headquarters, who was to drive it back there if Lockett and I stayed with the regiment. The guns, such desultory firing as there was, sounded more clearly now. The different noise of bombs was distinguishable. The formations on either side were of a more combatant kind, infantry resting, heavy artillery, and the usual light anti-aircraft. A few staff and liaison officers in jeeps and staff cars still passed, the jeeps often identifiable only by their passengers' heads showing out of enveloping dust clouds, but the traffic was now mostly supply vehicles moving between the combatant units and their B, or supply, echelons. 15 miles from our starting point, and about 4 miles in rear of the regiment, I found our B echelon, in charge of 2 officers whom I had known fairly well during my few months with the regiment, Mac, an ex-non-commissioned officer of the Scots Greys, now a captain, and Owen, a major, an efficient person with deceptive, adolescent manners, whom no one would suspect of being an old Etonian. It is difficult to imagine Owen at any public school at all. If you look at him, he seems to have sprung, miraculously enlarged but otherwise unaltered, from an inky bench in a private preparatory school. He looks as if he had white rats in his pockets. On these two, I had to test my story. I was afraid the idea of my running back to the regiment would seem absurd to them, so I began non-committally by greeting them and asking where the regiment was. "A few miles up the road," said Mac. "They're out of action at the moment, but they're expecting to go in again any time." "Have you come back to us?" I said that depended on the colonel. "Oh, he'll be glad to see you," said Mac. "I don't think A Squadron's got many officers left. They had a bad day the other day. I lost all my vehicles in B1 the same night. Petrol lorry got hit and lit up the whole scene, and they just plastered us with everything they had." In spite of this ominous news, I was encouraged by Mac saying I was needed and pushed on up the track until we came to the regiment. Tanks and trucks were jumbled close together, with most of the men busy doing maintenance on them. A tall ordnance officer, whom I had never seen, directed me to the same 1500-weight truck which had been the orderly room in the training area at Wadi Natron. I left my truck and walked, feeling more and more apprehensive as I approached this final interview. I looked about among the men as I went, but saw only 1 or 2 familiar faces. A regiment's personnel alters surprisingly, even in 8 months. I looked about for Edward, my squadron leader, and for Tom and Raoul, who had been troop leaders with me, but could not see them. The colonel, beautifully dressed and with his habitual indolence of hand, returned my salute from inside the 1500-weight, where he was sitting with Graham, the adjutant, a handsome, red-haired, amiable young Etonian. I said to Piccadilly Jim, the colonel, "Good evening, sir. I've escaped from division for the moment, so I wondered if I'd be any use to you up here." "Well, Keith," he said, stroking his moustache and looking like a contented ginger cat, "we're most glad to see you, as always. All the officers in A Squadron, except Andrew, are casualties, so I'm sure he'll welcome you with open arms. We're probably going in early tomorrow morning, so you'd better go and get him to fix you up with a troop now." After a few more politenesses, I went to find Andrew, and my kit. The tremendous question was decided, and in a disconcertingly abrupt and definite way, after 8 months of abortive efforts to rejoin. Palestine was a long way off, and a few miles to the west, where the sounds of gunfire had intensified, lay the German armies. I found Andrew, sitting on a petrol tin beside his tanks. I had met him before, but when he looked up at my approach, he did not recognize me. He was not young, and although at the moment he was an acting major about to go into action in a tank for the first time in his life, Andrew had already seen service in Abyssinia, in command of the native mercenaries who had been persuaded to fight for Haile Selassie. From Abyssinia he had come to Cairo and fallen, through that British military process which penalizes anyone who changes his job, from colonel to major. Later he had gravitated to base depot and, being unemployed, returned to his war substantive rank of captain. As a captain, he had come back to the regiment. It is not difficult to picture the state of mind of a man who knows he has worked well and receives no reward except to be demoted 2 grades. He now found himself second in command of a squadron whose squadron leader had been a subaltern under him before. What happened after that was probably inevitable. Andrew's health and temper were none the better for the evil climate and conditions of his late campaign. Someone who knew him before, which I did not, said that he went away a charming and entertaining young man, and returned a hardened and embittered soldier. He was a small man, with blonde hair turning grey, sitting on a petrol tin and marking the cellophane of his map case with a chinograph pencil. His face was brick red with sun and wind, the skin cracking on his lips and nose. He wore a grey Indian Army flannel shirt, a pair of old corduroy trousers, and sandals. Round his mahogany-coloured neck a blue silk handkerchief was twisted and tied like a stock, and on his head was a beret. Like most ex-cavalrymen, he had no idea how to wear it. To him I reported, resplendent, if a little dusty, in polished cap and belt. He allotted me 2 tanks, as a troop, there not being enough on the squadron's strength to make sub-units of more than 2 tanks. I drove my lorry with the kit on it to one of the tanks and began to unload and sort out my belongings. Lockett and I laid them out, together with the 3 bags of emergency rations belonging to the lorry. The corporal, lately commander of this tank, departed, staggering under his own possessions barely confined by his ground sheet in an amorphous bundle. Lockett was to go, for the duration of the battle, to the technical stores lorry where he had a friend and where he could make himself useful. To him I handed over the greater part of my belongings, the style in which I had traveled at divisional headquarters being now outmoded. I kept a half share of the 3 bags of rations, which I distributed between my 2 tanks. This amounted to several tins of bully beef, of course, 1 or 2 tins of first American white potatoes, and some greater treasures, tins of American bacon rashers, and of fruit and condensed milk. A pair of clean socks were filled, one with tea, the other with sugar. I changed my peaked cap for a beret, and retained a small cricket bag with shirts, slacks, washing and shaving kit, writing paper, a camera, and a Penguin Shakespeare's sonnets. Rolled up in my valise and bedding were a suit of battle dress, my revolver, and a British warm. In my pocket I had a small flask of whiskey, and in the locker on the side of the tank, in addition to the rations, I put some tins of NAAFI coffee and OXO cubes, bought in Alexandria. I now felt the satisfaction of anyone beginning an expedition, or, as Barbet Azar might have said on this occasion, a voyage, in contemplating my assembled stores, and in bestowing them. As soon as this was finished, I began to make the acquaintance of my tank crews. My own tank was a Mark III Crusader, then comparatively new to us all. I had once been inside the Mark II, which had a 2-pounder gun and a 4-man crew, and was now superseded by this tank with a 6-pounder gun and only 3 men in the crew, the place of the 4th being occupied by the breech mechanism of the 6-pounder. This tank is the best-looking medium tank I ever saw, whatever its shortcomings of performance. It is low-built, which in desert warfare, and indeed all tank warfare, is a first consideration. This gives it, together with its lines and its suspension on 5 great wheels aside, the appearance almost of a speedboat. To see these tanks crossing country at speed was a thrill which seemed inexhaustible. Many times it encouraged us, and we were very proud of our Crusaders, though we often had cause to curse them. From underneath this particular tank, a pair of boots protruded. As I looked at them, my mind, being still by a matter of 2 days untrained to it, did not make the inevitable association of ideas. The whole man emerged, muttering in a Glaswegian monotone. He was a small man with a seemingly disgruntled youngster's face, called Moody. I found him, during the weeks I spent with him, to be lazy, permanently discontented, and a most amusing talker. In battle he did not have much opportunity for talking and was silent even during rests and meals, but at all other times, he would wake up talking, as birds do, at the first gleam of light and long before dawn, and he would still be talking in the invariable monotone long after dark. He was the driver of the tank. The gunner was another reservist. His name was Evan, and he looked a very much harder case than Moody, though I think there was not much to choose between them. Evan scarcely spoke at all, and if drawn into conversation, would usually reveal, if he were talking to an officer, a number of injustices under which he was suffering at the moment, introducing them with a calculated air of weariness and it doesn't matter now, as though he had been so worn down by the callousness of his superiors as to entertain little hope of redress. In conversation with his fellows, I say fellows because he had no friends, he affected a peculiar kind of snarling wit, and he never did anything that was not directly for his own profit. Moody would often do favors for other people. Evan would prefer an officer and then only if he could not well avoid it. Yet he was unexpectedly quick and efficient on 2 occasions which I shall describe. We were at an hour's notice to move. This meant, not that we should move in an hour's time, but that, if we did move, we should have an hour in which to prepare for it. When I had sorted out my belongings, and eaten some meat and vegetable stew and tinned fruit, washed down with coffee, I lay down on my bedding with a magazine which someone had left on the tank. Glancing only vaguely at the pages, I thought over the changes of the last few days, and confronted myself with the future. Desultory thumps sounded in the distance, occasionally large bushes of dust sprang up on the skyline, or a plane droned across, very high up in the blue air. Men passed and repassed, shouted to each other, laughed, sang, and whistled dance tunes, as they always did. Metallic clangs and the hum of light and heavy engines at various pitches sounded in the distance. Occasionally a machine gun would sputter for a few seconds, as it was tested or cleared. The whole conglomeration of sounds, mixing in the heat of declining afternoon, would have put me to sleep, but for my own excitement and apprehensions, and the indefatigable flies. But though I reflected, a little uncomfortably, on what might be happening to me in a few hours, I was not dissatisfied. I still felt the exhilaration of cutting myself free from the whole net of inefficiency and departmental nonsense that had seemed to have me quite caught up in divisional headquarters. I had exchanged a vague and general existence for a simple and particular, and perhaps short, one. Best of all, I had never realized how ashamed of myself I had been in my safe job at division until, with my departure, this feeling was suddenly gone. I had that feeling of almost unstable lightness which is felt physically immediately after putting down a heavy weight. All my difficult mental inquiries and arguments about the future were shelved, perhaps permanently. I got out my writing paper and wrote 2 letters, one to my mother and one to David Hicks in Cairo. Although in writing these letters, which, of course, got lost and were never posted, I felt very dramatic, the tone of them was not particularly theatrical. To my mother, I wrote that I rejoiced to have escaped at last from division and to be back with the regiment. I might not have time to write for a week or 2, I added. To Hicks, I sent a poem which I had written during my last 2 days at division on an idea which I had had since a month before the offensive. I asked him to see that it got home, as I had not got a stamp or an airgraph. He could print it in his magazine on the way, if he liked. I had asked Andrew 1 or 2 questions in the hope of not showing myself too ignorant in my first action. But it was fairly plain that he knew nothing himself. I shouldn't worry, old boy, was all he would say. The squadron and troop leaders don't use maps much, and there are no codes at all. Just talk as you like over the air, except for giving map references, of course, but you won't need them. You'll find it's quite simple. When I had written my letters, I got into the turret with Evan and tried to learn its geography. My place as tank commander was on the right of the 6-pounder. I had a seat, from which I could look out through a periscope. This afforded a very small view, and in action, all tank commanders stand on the floor of their turret so that their eyes are clear of the top, or actually sit in the manhole on top of their turret with their legs dangling inside. Behind the breech of the 6-pounder is a metal shield to protect the crew against the recoil of the gun, which leaps back about a foot when it is fired. On my side of the 6-pounder was a rack for a box of machine gun ammunition, the belt of which had to run over the 6-pounder and into the machine gun mounted on the other side of it. There were also 2 smoke dischargers to be operated by me. Stacked round the sides of the turret were the 6-pounder shells, nose downwards, hand grenades, smoke grenades, and machine gun ammunition. At the back of the turret, on a shelf, stood the wireless set, with its control box for switching from the A set to internal communication between the tank crew, and on top of the wireless set, a pair of binoculars, wireless spare parts, and Tommy gun magazines. There was a Tommy gun in a clip on Evan's side of the turret. On the shelf, when we were in action, we usually kept also some Penguin books, chocolate or boiled sweets if we could get them, a tin of processed cheese, a knife, and some biscuits. We were lucky enough to begin the battle with a tin of Australian butter as well. About dusk, the wireless sets in all tanks were switched on and netted into the regimental control station, to make sure everyone's set was as far as possible on the same frequency. Each station, like too low in early broadcasting, was known by a call sign, by which it announced itself and was called up by control stations. Before dark, I went over to make sure that my other tank was ready to move, completely filled with rations, kit, petrol, oil, ammunition, and water. I stayed some time talking to the crew. The corporal, Browning, had already been captured and recaptured during the first 4 days of the battle. He said the Germans had treated him very well, and seemed quite cheerful, so did his gunner and driver, at the prospect of going into action again. This was more than could be said of Evan and Moody, who grew durer and more taciturn every minute. I lay down to sleep in my clothes, covered with my British warm and blankets, for the nights were already beginning to be cold. Perhaps betrayed by the spectacle of the stars as clear as jewels on black velvet into a mood of more solemnity, I suddenly found myself assuming that I was going to die tomorrow. For perhaps a quarter of an hour, I considered to what possibilities of suffering, more than of death, I had laid myself open. This was with the dramatic and emotional part of me, but my senses of proportion and humor, like 2 court jesters, chased away the tragic poet, and I drifted away on a tide of odd thoughts, watching the various signs of battle in the lower sky. I persuaded myself that I had passed the worst ordeals of fear and that there would be no time for sharp, instantaneous fear in battle. If I thought so, I was not long to be deceived. The moon, now grown much greater than when, a week or two ago, she had inspired me to write a poem on her ominous pregnancy, presided over a variety of lesser lights, star shells, traces of orange, green, red, blue, and a harsh white, and the deeper colors of explosions. We were still at an hour's notice. Someone shook me from my sleep at 4 o'clock in the cold morning. Somewhat to my surprise, I woke immediately, with the full consciousness of where I was, for I had feared, as I dropped asleep, that the morning might surprise me unpleasantly at my least heroic hour. The moment I was fully awake, I had to be busy. We were to move at 5. Before that, engines and sets had to be warmed up, orders had to be passed down through the whole hierarchy, from the colonel to the tank crews. In the half-light, the tanks seemed to crouch, still but alive, like toads. I touched the cold metal shell of my own tank, my fingers amazed for a moment at its hardness, and swung myself into the turret to get out my map case. Of course, it had fallen down onto the small, circular steel floor of the turret. In getting down after it, I contrived to hit my head on the base of the 6-pounder and scratch open both my hands. Inside the turret, there is less room even than in an aircraft, and it requires experience to move about. By the time I came up, a general activity had begun to warm the appearance of the place, if not the air of it. The tanks were now half hidden in clouds of blue smoke as their engines began, one after another, to grumble, and the stagnant oil burned away. This scene, with the silhouettes of men and turrets interrupted by swirls of smoke and the sky lightening behind them, was to become familiar to me through many repetitions. Out of each turret, like the voices of dwarfs, thin, cracked, and bodiless, came the voices of the operators and of the control set. They spoke to the usual accompaniment of mush, morse, odd squeals, and the peculiar jangling, like a barrel organ, of an enemy jamming station. Probably as a result of some vacillation by higher authority, nobody moved before 7 o'clock, when the Crusader squadron, my squadron, moved out and onto the other side of a main track running north to south. Here we halted, having left the heavy squadrons of Shermans and Grants still in our rest area, and were allowed to brew up. The immense moral satisfaction and recreation of brewing up was one I had never realized. As soon as the permission is given, all crews except those of tanks detailed for lookout duties swarm out of their turrets. The long boxes on the side of the tank are opened, tins of bacon or meat and vegetable rations, according to the time of day, are taken out, while someone lights a fire in a tin filled with a paste of sand and petrol. A veteran blackened half of a petrol tin, with a twisted wire handle, is unhooked from some extremity of the tank and filled with water for tea. Within 5 minutes, a good crew has a cup of immensely strong and sweet hot tea, and sandwiches, for example, of oatmeal biscuits fried in bacon fat, enclosing crisp bacon. If there is a little more time, it will probably be used to make another brew of tea from the same leaves, and to eat more biscuits spread with oleomargarine, horrible but wholesome, and Palestinian marmalade. This morning, I found printed on my tin of marmalade the name of the communal settlement at Givet Brenner, where I had spent a day 4 or 5 months before. Thoughts of those quiet trees and that peaceful, industrious community induced a minute or two of nostalgia, and a less logical but more comfortable sense of friends following me. Soon after breakfast, we were turned round and returned to camp. I never discovered why we made this excursion. We did not move again until late afternoon, when the regiment moved out, Crusaders leading, in single file onto the track up which I had come the day before. The head of the column turned westwards, only turrets and pennants, flown on the small aerials, showing above the billowing dust. I took a photograph of the column behind and in front of me. That afternoon was still and sunny, the upper air clear, the ground churned everywhere into white dust by the endless traffic. This white dust lay very thickly rutted on the ground and mixed with the atmosphere, like a mist for a foot or two above the desert. Even without looking at the formations lying beside the track and stretching away from it, it was impossible not to feel an immense, subdued activity all over the area. On the track, besides our own column of tanks moving up slowly, screened and enveloped in their own dust, tanks and armored cars passed us going out of battle, and a renewed traffic of staff cars and jeeps made it clear that the front line had advanced since the previous night, when few of them were coming so far forward. These smaller vehicles bucketed in and out among the main streams of traffic. Up above, in the clear sky, a solitary aeroplane moved, bright silver in the sunlight, a pale line of exhaust marking its unhurried course. The Bofors gunners on either side of us were running to their guns and soon opened a rapid, thumping fire, like a titanic workman hammering. The silver body of the aeroplane was surrounded by hundreds of little grey smudges, through which it sailed on serenely. From it there fell away, slowly and gracefully, an isolated shower of rain, a succession of glittering drops. I watched them descend 100 feet before it occurred to me to consider their significance and forget their beauty. The column of tanks trundled forward imperturbably, but the heads of their crews no longer showed. I dropped down in the turret and shouted to Evan, who was dozing in the gunner's seat, "Someone is dropping some stuff." He shouted back a question and adjusted his earphones. "Bombs," I said into the microphone. Their noisy arrival somewhere on our right confirmed the word. Control called us over the air. "Nuts 1, is everybody okay? 2 okay off. 3 okay off. 4 okay off," said the troop leaders in turn. 5 okay off, I completed the group. The journey continued. The view from a moving tank is like that in a camera obscura or a silent film, in that since the engine drowns all other noises except explosions, the whole world moves silently. Men shout, vehicles move, airplanes fly over, all soundlessly. The noise of the tank, being continuous, perhaps for hours on end, creates an effect of silence. It is the same in an aircraft, but unless you are flying low, distance does away with the effect of a soundless pageant. I think it may have been the fact that for so much of the time I saw it without hearing it, which led me to feel that the country into which we were now moving was an illimitably strange land, quite unrelated to real life, like the scenes in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Silence is a strange thing to us who live. We desire it, we fear it, we worship it, we hate it. There is a divinity about cats. As long as they are silent, the silence of swans gives them an air of legend. The most impressive thing about the dead is their triumphant silence, proof against anything in the world. A party of prisoners now appeared, marching on our left. They were evidently very tired, but looked about them with a good deal of interest, particularly at our column. I thought of innumerable pictures of glowering SS men in Nazi tanks, and glared at them through my goggles in the hope of looking like part of an inexorable war machine myself. They must have been fairly impressed with the strength and concentration of our forces by the time they reached their cage at the rear. About 200 of them passed us, in batches, as we continued our journey. We looked at them with an interest equal to their own. They did not look very fearsome. They were almost all Germans, with shapeless green or khaki drill uniforms and floppy peaked caps with a red, white, and black bullseye on them. The desert on either side of the track became more sparsely populated with vehicles, and at length there were none but derelicts. The column halted at last, so that my tank stood beside the burnt-out shell of a German Mark IV Special, with its long gun and rows of little wheels. Most of one side of it had been torn out, probably by the explosion of its own ammunition. Some charred clothing lay beside it, but no equipment, and there was no sign of the crew. The whole thing made a disconcerting, cautionary picture. On the horizon to our front, we could see 2 vehicles burning fiercely, from which expanding columns of black smoke slanted across the orange sky. We could see shells, visible by their traces as yellow or white lights, sailing in apparently slow curves across our front. They were being fired by tanks on our left, but were landing in dead ground to us. By now, the light was ebbing perceptibly, and soon the burning derelicts and the shell traces gleamed against the sky. The traces of enemy shells could be seen flying from beyond the ridge ahead of us. We were now spectators of the closing stages of the day's battle. That concludes the first part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.